Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. Hello, and thanks for joining us. You're listening to part one of a two-part series interviewing Dr. Anita Johnston, who's author of Eating in the Light of the Moon, the director of Pono Residential Eating Disorder Treatment Facility. She is a licensed psychologist and a certified eating disorder specialist. We are so lucky to have her on the podcast. So here's part one of part two. Look out for part two coming up soon.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. I am delighted to have a special guest with us on the podcast today, Dr. Anita Johnston. Dr. Johnston is a leader in the field. She is an author of Eating in the Light of the Moon. She's also the co-creator of Light of the Moon Café, which is an e-course and online support circle, basically an interactive workbook for your Light of the Moon book. She also serves as the clinical director of Pono Eating Disorders Programs in Hawaii and Pono Maui, which is an eating disorder residential facility. And she's also a consultant for EATFED in Sydney, which stands for Education and Treatment for Eating Difficulties Center. So welcome, Anita. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I wanted to talk about how you think about recovery. What is recovery? Because the podcast is just starting and maybe people are new to figuring out what is eating disorder recovery. And it's a big word. So I was wondering if we could unpack that a little bit.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that there's a lot of joy in the recovery process. So, yes, it is hard work at times, but there's also moments in this journey that are exhilarating and inspiring and even peaceful. So it is a journey, but it is a journey with a destination, actually, because I believe, and I've seen this, I've been working in the field for over 30 years, so I know it to be true, that it is totally possible for somebody to absolutely, completely recovered, period.
Right. I'm a believer. I'm in that camp too, the recovered period camp, where you really don't have any more eating disorder left in your life.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean there aren't stops along the way. So somebody can, be hanging out in the recovery process for quite some time, or for some people, that's enough for them. Mm-hmm. And if this is where, someone feels like, okay, this is good enough for me, that's perfectly fine. But I think a lot of people are afraid to even begin the recovery process because they think it will never end.
Right. I feel like we're on the same page, because I was just going to ask you. So let's say that someone has been wrestling with an eating disorder for several years and they're finally deciding, okay, I need to seek treatment for this. And the idea of recovery sounds nice, but it also sounds very ethereal and freeform, and people don't even know what that's going to look like. What would you say to that person who's just at the beginning, who maybe has that difficulty imagining what it would be like to be fully recovered, period?
Well, I think it's important. Like I said, there's steps along the way. So really the first step is to go, okay, I don't want to keep doing this anymore. I want a life that is different and free from the struggle. And I think to move then to the next step, first of all, you have to understand that it is possible. Otherwise, why bother?
Right.
Right. It's like if you're going to, do all the gymnastics that's required and all the hard work, you really do need to have a glimpse and an idea of where you're headed. But I think in the very beginning, you have to understand that there's meaning to the struggle. so that if you don't understand that, you're left with this belief, well, there's something wrong with me. I'm flawed. I'm damaged goods in some way. I screwed up and here I am. Sure. And I don't look at it at all that way. So when I'm working with somebody, the first task is to introduce the idea that whatever it is they're doing with food or eating or weight has served a function in their lives. There's meaning to it. It's not just a ridiculous thing.
Right. I remember when I was early in my recovery process reading your book, actually, and reading that story of the log. And part of that talks about how eating disorders have this adaptive functioning that has benefited you or kept you safe in some way. And I remember that being so healing to hear, because up to that point you just think, what the hell am I doing with food? Why am I doing this to myself? And why can't I stop?
And what's wrong with me?
Right. What's wrong with me? Yes.
Yeah. Oftentimes when a client would come to see me, I would say something and they would look at me a little askance, because I would say, the day is going to come when you're going to see your eating disorder as your best friend. And I can just see the look in their eye going, oh, great. I'm coming to this woman for help, and she's crazy. Get me out of here. But when I explain the metaphor of what I'm talking about is, imagine that you got yourself a brand new car, and it's the first car you've ever had, and you're all excited about it, and you leave the dealership just happy as can be, enjoying your car, but then after a while you've been driving, and some lights keep going on in the dash that are really annoying. And so you go back to the dealer and you go, okay, I love my car, but these lights, is there something you can do? Can you disconnect them? And the dealer says, sure, I can disconnect them, but you should know that this light here, this is the one that's going to tell you when you're out of gas. And this light here is the one that's going to tell you that you need oil. And if I disconnect them, you could either end up in the middle of nowhere out of fuel, or you could burn up your engine because you didn't put oil in when it needed it. Do you still want me to disconnect the lights?
Right.
So, you see, once you understand the meaning, that there's meaning to the symptomology even, there's meaning to what you're doing, but you just don't know what it is yet. So before you get rid of the lights, it might be a good idea to tap into what they might mean. So I think that's it's a bit of a different approach, because many people say, let's just get rid of what I'm doing and be done with it. Well, the problem with that is if you get rid of the symptomology, it could pop up someplace else.
Right. I'm a believer that you have to have skills to make the behaviors and the thoughts and ultimately everything better. But if you don't understand where it's coming from, it's just going to come back later.
Yeah, it's I think of recovery as it's a weed. So with the eating disorder, if you just cut it off at the top, given the right circumstances, it's going to come right back.
Absolutely.
But if you go down, clear the roots, then it's a done deal, and you can be free of the eating disorder the rest of your life. That being said, every once in a while, and I don't know any of you who have gardened, but every once in a while, if you leave a little piece of root with one of these weeds that can really grow, it can come popping back up. So understanding that there's reasons why someone is doing whatever they're doing with food, and that they're good reasons. And they're good reasons in the sense that they're serving a function that you don't know how to do any other way. And so then the task begins, okay, find out first what that is. Then you can begin to develop the skills.
Right.
And that's the log story.
Right.
Want me to tell it?
Yes, I want you to tell it. And then I also want to kind of get into some examples, because I know that there are going to be people who listen to this and think, no, my eating disorder is awful. It's not helping me at all. I want it gone. And we're telling them that there are these adaptive functions to it. So yes, the log.
Okay, because that's why I use metaphor. Because one of the things that the eating disorder can do is it can set up amazing defenses. Because it's got its ideas and it's going to defend them sometimes to the death. So using metaphor, using story is a way to introduce different ideas that's a little more gentle. It's not like taking the eating disorder head on. It's like, well, let's consider this. So I remember the time that I was trying to explain this to a client of mine, and she was sitting across the room from me, and there were a lot of things I wanted to explain to her about the recovery process. And then this metaphor came to me, and so here we go. and it requires that you use your imagination.
I love that.
Marion Woodman, who's a Jungian analyst that I really respect, she says that eating disorders are a failure of the imagination. The way I see it is the people that struggle with eating disorders, they have amazing imaginations, but they use them improperly. They use them in service of the eating disorder, imagining all kinds of horrific things, you know, and it's really no fun. But if you could just take that very same skill set and use it to imagine recovery, it's a whole other story. So I use metaphors because it evokes imagination, which people with eating disorders usually have lots of. So imagine you're on the banks of a raging river. It's pouring down rain, and you slip and you fall in, and you're drowning. You're getting pulled down through the rapids. And along comes a big log, and the log saves your life because you grab onto it, and it keeps your head above water when surely you would have drowned. And eventually it carries you to a place in the river where the water's calm. And from there you can see the riverbank exactly where you want to go. But you can't get there because you're hanging so tightly onto the log you can barely even swim. So here's where the log is the metaphor for the eating disorder. It's important to understand that it served a function in your life, a very important function, in that it kept you from drowning in some very strong emotional currents. So it behooves you to see exactly what that function is. But, you know, recovery is not always that easy. And to make it more complicated, there's always people on the riverbank yelling, "Let go of the log, let go of the log." And you feel like an absolute idiot because you can't let go of the log.
Right, because it's scary to let go of it and just swim. Right.
Exactly. And it should be scary.
Right.
Because the way I see it is letting go of that log might not be the best thing to do initially. Because what would happen if you went, "Oh, okay, I'm coming," and you let go of the log, and you got halfway there, and you realize you don't have the strength to make it to shore. You don't have the strength and confidence to make it to shore. That means you don't have the strength to make it back to the log, and you're really sunk.
Right.
So I believe we all have a wise part of ourselves that knows this and won't let us let go of anything until we're good and ready. So where does that leave you? Well, now we bring in the skills. So you let go of the log and you try floating. And when you start to sink, you grab back on. Then you let go of the log and you try treading water. And when you get tired, you grab back on. Then you let go of the log and you swim around it once, grab back on. Twice, grab back on. 10 times, 100 times. 200 times, whatever it takes for you to have the strength and confidence to make it to shore. Then you can let go of the log.
Right.
It serves no function any longer once you develop another way of staying afloat and getting where you want to go in life.
Right. And something I hear really frequently with my clients too is that they're afraid that by engaging in treatment or really investing in their treatment and participating fully, that we're going to lasso them and pull them away from the log or something, as if the process is so easy that we could just completely take the eating disorder away.
As if we could. The truth of the matter is I can't get rid of anybody's eating disorder.
Me
I've never been able to. And it's important to understand that because the battle for someone with an eating disorder is internal. There's the part of themselves that wants the eating disorder, and there's the part of themselves that doesn't want the eating disorder. And so what my job is to help strengthen the part that doesn't want the eating disorder because it doesn't quite have the skills. It's not strong enough. I call that the soul self. I call that's the true essence of who you are.
Yeah.
And the way you can tell the difference between the eating disorder self and the soul self is that the eating disorder self is mean. It's
yes,
really
eating
mean.
disorders are so mean.
Say horrible things.
They do.
Your eating disorder self calls you names and says things you would never, ever, ever, ever say to your best friend.
Right.
Because it's mean.
Right. I've heard people say, if I said the things to my friend that my eating disorder said to me, someone would lock me up because they are mean and they're hopeless. Yeah. They're very discouraging.
Yeah, and so ultimately, I never get rid of anyone's eating disorder. But their soul self, their healthy self, is what gets rid of the eating disorder, not me.
Right.
So I don't even do battle with it. My job is, okay, how do we strengthen this other part of you, the most precious part of who you are? It's because it's the uniqueness of your being. You see, the eating disorder says, oh, you gotta act like and walk like and look like and think like and talk like the way we think everybody else wants you to be.
Which, by the way, is always a moving target. It's not even like you can get to that unrealistic point.
Right.
There's always something else.
Right. Because different people have different opinions and different desires. And so, yeah, if you're trying to match up with that. And so the eating disorder is really all about, okay, we're going to get you to fit in, even if you have to sell your soul. And so you strengthen the soul self. And that's the most unique part of your being. There's never been another Anita on this planet like me, and never will be. The same for you. The same for all of our listeners. Each one of us has something that is so precious because it's a constellation of qualities that have never been on the planet before and never will be again. Right. So I believe everybody is born with certain gifts. Interestingly enough, they're the gifts we have been given, but they're also the gifts that we've come to give.
Say more about that part.
Okay, so we all have qualities, and like I said, a special constellation that's unlike anybody else. So if you don't recognize and cultivate and appreciate the uniqueness of your being and this special gift that you bring, the world has lost something, because then you can't give it to the world. So for me, going back to our topic about recovery, this is what recovery is. It's not just stopping what you're doing with eating and stopping the thoughts and stopping the behaviors. It's about claiming the essence of who you are and moving in the world in that way, and then the gift is given. You don't even have to work at it.
Right. And I what's coming to me now is thinking about how I've definitely heard people say, well, first of all, who am I is a really big question. Like, I'm not sure I could even really answer that, and I'm a psychologist, so. But just that loss of connection with your identity, but also about how when you have this eating disorder, being able to even picture getting to a place where you're going to be your soul self or your authentic self or whatever, people choose to call that part of you. First of all, I think that process is difficult to envision. But secondly, the thing I hear a lot is that people are afraid that once their eating disorder isn't there, whatever's left over is going to not be good enough somehow. They're afraid of what they're going to find. And you're saying that what's there are all the gifts, like the treasures, the good stuff of who we are.
Because I've seen it. I've seen it hundreds of times over and over and over. This is why I do this work. I wouldn't be able to stay in this field for 3 decades if I hadn't had that experience over and over and over and over and over again of getting to see people recover. I mean, look at the word. Recover. So what are they recovering? Their true self. And it's beautiful. It's unbelievably beautiful. So I get it that people are afraid. They're afraid, if I find out who I am, what if I don't like? That's the voice of the eating disorder that says you're not going to like who you are. Remember, it's mean.
Right.
And so one of the skills that's worth developing in terms of strengthening your true self, your soul self, is curiosity.
Yes, I love that. I feel like I am newer to embracing curiosity, but it's so helpful, especially in the recovery process. So tell us about how you think people can use curiosity in their recovery.
Well, it's actually a critical piece, because here's the thing. If you believe everything that your eating disorder self says without questioning, oh, is that true? How do you know that's true? Where'd you get that idea? Where'd that come from? If you once you start getting curious, then it's sort of like you start to see, well, the emperor has no clothes. It's really not what everybody says it is. So that this quality of curiosity then can, expand, and then you can just get really curious. Let's say somebody says something mean to you or critical. If you get curious, you can say, wow, I wonder what's going on with them, that they are wanting to talk about my thighs. What a strange thing that is. How curious.
Right.
What possibly could get somebody so interested in the body parts of another person? You see what I'm saying? It's like I'm taking it to the level of absurdity, but you do want to play with it if you can get curious.
Right.
Because the opposite of curiosity is judgment.
I was going to say, I love that you have to be in that non-judgmental stance, especially I think it's helpful with other people, especially when you have people critiquing your body.
And curiosity is the antidote to that.
Right.
So when you start to really think about that, it really helps to pull you out. I have another story around that. You want to hear a story?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I want to hear all your stories. You can tell stories all day.
So this is a story because I'm always on the hunt for a good story or a metaphor. And this is one I came across. I was doing some speaking in Kansas City, Missouri. And during the break, I was taken to a art museum. And there was this artist. I wish I could remember the artist's name, but I don't. I only remember the story. And the artist had taken some pretty famous paintings of the great masters and then painted his own version in different colors, and they were huge. And then he took plexiglass and he screwed on sheets of plexiglass in front of the paintings, and then with white paint, he wrote stories. So the one that caught my attention was this painting of the judges, and they were in their robes with their white wigs, and they're sitting behind the desk, and the story in front of it was this. There was this crow and a nightingale in the forest, and the nightingale was singing and singing and singing, and she was just enjoying listening to the sound of her song reverberate through the treetops. And the crow said, "Would you shut up already? Cut out that racket. That's just the worst thing I've ever heard. It's such a stupid song, and it's ridiculous." And the nightingale said, "Oh, no, you don't understand. We nightingales, we're known for our beautiful singing." Right. And the crow said, "I don't think so. That's just the worst thing I ever heard. It's ridiculous. You're polluting the forest with all that racket." And along came a pig. And the pig heard them quarreling. And the pig said, "Listen, I'm a connoisseur of fine music. Why don't we have a contest? And I will be the judge." And so they agreed. So the nightingale sang her song and the crow cawed. And the pig immediately declared the crow the winner. And the nightingale burst into tears. And the crow says, "I can't believe you. Not only are you a horrible singer, you're a lousy loser." And the nightingale said, I'm not crying because I lost. I'm crying because the pig was my judge." The moral of the story is consider the source. What do pigs know about music? Nothing. They know about all kinds of other things. I love pigs. I always wanted to pet pigs
too.
So this is not a diss on pigs. But it is important to consider the source. Who is that person that is saying that? What's going on with them that they would choose to make that kind of comment?
Right.
So, we live in a world with, people say mean things about other people's bodies, hypercritical. But if we could just stop to say, wait a minute, what's going on with them? I mean, why would my 16-year-old brother have made a comment about my thunder thighs when I was 13. Wait, what would, here's the curiosity piece, like, wait, why would he even make that his business? And then you start getting curiouser and curiouser. And there's all kinds of answers to that. Maybe he's mad at something I said to him, and so he knows that I don't like my thighs, and so he jumped on that wagon.
Right.
Or maybe he's just starting to deal with his own sexuality and doesn't know how to deal with girls turning into women and getting curves.
Right.
There's that story. Or maybe he had heard his friends do it, and so he thought this was cool, and he's so insecure because he's just not cool yet. But he thought if he said cool things, then maybe he was cool. You see what I'm saying? It's like there's
infinite possibilities,
it goes
really.
on and
right.
on. But it takes it away from the belief that that person has the capacity to judge you. They judge you by things they know nothing about. So I think, that's why I love that little story, because it brings out the curiosity piece versus the judgment piece.
Right. Which is so important. Now so you said earlier, that there's a lot of meaning and metaphor and a lot you can learn from the actual things that people do with food. And there's symbolism there. And that's really what you've taught people for so many years. Will you tell us a little bit about some of those things that you've noticed about what food can mean and what different behaviors can mean, and how people can kind of tap into just the process of trying to be curious about what's going on there for them?
That's my very favorite part of the recovery process. Because when you start getting curious, what you discover are that there are patterns. And so, for example, and it's the patterns that really hold a lot of information for all of us. So I don't even much believe in hardcore diagnoses of eating disorders, because I don't find that as useful as looking at the patterns. And typically what I see is that maybe somebody who's been diagnosed with anorexia, they're really into food restriction, but that is not the only thing they're restricting. They're restricting new relationships, and they're restricting their emotions, and they're restricting new experiences, and they're restricting their sexuality, and they're always putting themselves on restriction. Right. So that theme of restriction runs through the whole of their lives. And so if you can start to get to what's the meaning of that, then it gets very interesting. And someone who's binging and purging, they're not just doing that with food. They're doing that with so many areas in their life. They might binge on college classes and take a bunch of classes and then think, oh my God, this is too much, and I got to get rid of them.
Right.
Or they might do this with relationships. They might meet somebody and go, oh, she's my best friend. We're just really, really close. And want to do everything together. And then, oh my God, I can't stand her any longer. She's just getting on my nerves.
Yeah.
So that they may do this process of taking in more than they can assimilate very quickly, not pacing themselves, and then all of a sudden go, oh my gosh, I've just done some damage that has to be undone. That's everywhere in their lives.
Right.
And someone who's struggling with binge eating, maybe gotten a diagnosis of binge eating disorder, when you look at the theme of scarcity in their life, they don't just act like there's never enough food. There's never enough coffee. There's never enough time.
Yeah.
There's never enough money.
Right.
There's never enough attention, never enough affection. And so to really explore then with curiosity the issue of scarcity is what's really going to be most fruitful.
Right.
Because now these are the root issues that we see demonstrated in the eating and weight behaviors. But there's way, way more to the story.
Right, that we see them in multiple areas of people's lives. Yeah.
And that's the fun part, really.
Right.
Because it's not like, oh my gosh, we've got to deal with this food stuff. It's like, no, let's look. Let's put on our detective hat. And so oftentimes that's another thing I would say to clients is that, okay, let's put on the detective hat and just get as curious as we can be. Now, a good detective sometimes has to go through the garbage. So it's like going to some yucky places and looking, in the areas we don't really want to go, but a good detective would go there. Right. And so if you can approach the eating disorder recovery the way you would as a detective, curiosity, or a scientist, we're gathering data here. We don't know what, we're just gathering data, or a journalist. Let's observe. Let's see what's going on. Yeah.
Let's that thing that you're thinking other people are thinking about you. Let's check it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why group is wonderful too, by the way. I love group therapy.
I love group for that.
Yes. Yeah. So helpful.
Yeah. Because we come up with, remember, with our imagination, we can create a gazillion stories in our minds. Most of them are not true. I think it was Mark Twain that said, I've had so many horrible experiences in my life, and it's a good thing most of them never happened. Right. The idea is we can create and catastrophize like nobody's business. And so in group, typically you can find out, oh no, that's not what I was thinking, or no, that's not at all how I heard what you were saying, or whatever. You get that immediate feedback, which is precious.
Right. I think it's so helpful for that. And it's always amazing and really an honor to see people do that when they have this thing that they're worried about being judged about in group. And then they share with the group, I'm worried about that you're thinking this. And then everyone in the group is looking at them with this expression of course we're not. So really helpful with just checking the facts, check the data.
What an opportunity.
Right.
Because the truth is, it's not like, there's those weird eating sort of folks, and then there's the rest of us. We all do this to one degree or another.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was delightful to hear all of your stories and your insights. Thank you so much.
So much fun.
And we can find you, if listeners want to connect with you, at dranitajohnston.com, correct? Is that the best place to find you?
And lightofthemooncafe.com. Or iPono, AIPONO, Maui.com.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. This podcast is produced by me, Dr. Janine Anderson, and Elise Barbuck.